Steve, is your driveway shoveled, cleared? We got a lot of snow.
You did? You did?
Yeah, last Friday we got like 5 inches.
Okay. Yes, ours is cleared. Had to do it again after some drifting stuff, and I think we have some neighbors away, so I went over and cleared theirs. Either that or they're just waiting me out to clear it for them. So
Are you a snow? Do you have a snow blower?
we have a tractor with the plow.
Ah, okay. All right. Well, look at
I'm
you
not
being all
smart enough for the
fancy.
snow plow. Like the one I've had one before, and it kind of gets clogged up. So
Okay.
I call it my aerobics if I don't do something. That's my
All right.
workout for the day.
There you go. All right. Anyways, this is the Stuff Summer Says podcast
Steve,
with Steve. Yeah, we've got really snow plows and snowmobiles and anything else snow to talk about. No, we got a lot of numbers to talk about today, I think is a good way to discuss, and a little bit of
okay.
basketball talk. And we're also going to talk about Ohio State because they're in the news. Um, so yeah, I'm ready. You ready to dive in?
Let's do it.
All right. Let's start with the biggest news in the college sports world, in my opinion, in the last week, or at least feels like a week ago, but also feels like yesterday. At least in Penn State dome, and then of course in Ohio State dome, and that is Bill O'Brien is going to go be the offensive coordinator at Ohio State. Um, and it still is something that I kind of have chuckled and laughed about, and just I don't know. I, as somebody that loves Bill O'Brien, that knows what Bill O'Brien did for this program, and I don't fault him for taking the job at Ohio State, but boy, is it weird that he took a job at Ohio State. Like I feel weird about it.
Yeah, I do. The first place I went was, well, Columbus has good hospitals for the kids, right? Or
Right.
kid. Yeah, it's gonna feel weird. I mean, maybe not so much for some people as Larry Johnson, but maybe just as more for some people than Larry Johnson, right? Like he helped save the program, right? So it just feels weird, but that's where we're at now. He lost a job in New England. He's got to find a job somewhere, God forbid, to pay the rent, and it's going to be at Ohio State.
I I was thinking about it in the context of Larry Johnson. And in the Larry Johnson thing, it to the outside perspective, I understood why he did it, but to the outside perspective, it very much felt like a slap in the face based on who Larry Johnson was. And then I think as kind of time has gone on and those wounds have healed, like I still think I understand why he made that decision to go there. And I don't think it was as much of a slap in the face. I just think the the thing that is interesting about Bill O'Brien is the timing in all of this, because once again, first off, I guess we begin with the fact that this will be November 2nd is now Bill O'Brien's return to Beaver Stadium. And I don't think anybody had it on paper as him coming in there as Ohio State's assistant coach. And I think the second thing with it is it it's kind of one of those questions of like, or one of those moments of really, like, it could have been anybody else, but really it had to be Ohio State because of the way Ohio State's had Penn State's number for the last umpteen years. It's going to be, on paper, at least, looks like the most crucial game of the season yet again. I can't even imagine the message boards and the comments if Penn State loses to Ohio State and Bill O'Brien's the head coach, while James Franklin was the head coach at Penn State, and it's just going to be a giant mess. Is all I'm just going to say if Penn State loses.
Wow, you're worried about him losing? Yeah, yeah, that's a ways out there, and they could. I mean, it's what makes college football. Well, it's not what makes college football fun because this stuff didn't feel like it happened as much
Mm-hmm.
10 years ago, 5 years ago, even. Um, no, I think O'Brien. I don't. I think O'Brien liked Penn State for college football more than he thought he would. I think he feels like more of a pro football coach. He did the redemption tour in Alabama to get the place to go back somewhere, and now the job caravan is just carousel. Sorry, has stopped, and he didn't have a ride on it except for Ohio State. Um, yeah, it'll feel weird. I mean, he's only here those couple of years, but made a big impact. And of course, it had to be Ohio State, right? Like of all the times you think, oh, it's going to be this, and then Ohio State's signing more players and doing more things, and you think, oh, this could be the year they get them. They lose the quarterback, they're using some players. Oh, lo and behold, transfer plural. There's some more players, and there's Ohio State looking like they're going to be okay next year again, maybe even better than okay.
I'm interested in it because and we'll get back to the transfer portal stuff here in a second because I do have a note on that I want to hit on. But I'm interested in it for a couple of other reasons, and some of them are dumb logistical things, but like the fact that Bill O'Brien didn't show up in the post game or pre-game pump up video until about 2 seasons ago, and now is he gonna be removed? Like it's just like this weird awkward elephant in the room of, do you acknowledge the fact that this guy who saved the program, who probably didn't get, at least in my opinion, enough acknowledgement of that from the current administration, from the current coach, do you still keep him in? Because now he's coaching at the main rival or the main team that's had your number for past couple of years. I think about that. And I just think about it in the Bill O'Brien and James Franklin kind of relationship, because I guess, they worked together at Maryland. Mark Wogenrich had a great shot of a media guide, and one page is Bill O'Brien and the other page is James Franklin, back-to-back pages. And it's interesting because it seems like there wasn't like a great relationship there, or maybe the two couldn't have stand each other. And I don't know. It's just like one more little plot twist of college football that you're right. No, I mean, I know it doesn't happen as often, but it does make it fun. I think
No,
it
in
was,
the vacuum and absence of actual information about it, those two things are both interesting, right? The pump up video at the stadium. The best thing is, people are going to debate this. This is going to be a discussion. This is going to be an actual meeting. At least a portion of it is, do we pull that out? Do we not pull it out? You know what? Dude coached here. Stick it in there. Don't overthink it. Do whatever, right? And then the relationship between the two. My perception before James Franklin showed up, or at least we got to hear more from James Franklin, was that perhaps there wasn't a good relationship, and maybe that was skewed by what I was hearing from OB. But I think as Franklin got a little more comfortable here and decided, probably wisely, not to air anything or complain about anything, it was, oh yeah, Billy and I got along great, right? So, and you don't know, right? But it's just because you don't know, and because you never really will know, because assistant coaches don't talk, head coaches aren't going to waste time talking about that. Nobody's going to say anything negative. That's the kind of speculation that adds to the speculation over, who should make the playoff, that makes college football what it is.
it's amazing how that game went from, like, I think a lot of Penn Staters have the USC game in mind, the UCLA game in mind, really that middle stretch of the season in general that a lot of Penn State fans are keying in on, right? But it's amazing how all of a sudden that once again became the most important, most interesting game of the season, literally within the span of 2 hours.
Well, in a couple weeks after the season, Ohio State's lost its quarterback. You assume Marvin Harrison's not coming back. They've got changes. Ryan Day is under pressure for, God forbid, winning 11 games a year. And, it was one you could look at and say, oh, maybe next year, of course, just like this year, maybe next year, maybe this is the year we're going to get them. And then that changes. And the other ones are interesting and different because they're new on the schedule. But sometimes familiarity breeds the contempt, and there it's going to be.
Yeah. The other thing I did want to hit on Ohio State related, and I swear we're not becoming an Ohio State podcast. We'll still focus on Penn State, but I think this was just interesting in the sports media landscape. Did you see the alleged rumor that Ohio State dumped $13 million into their NIL program over the last couple weeks to keep the players? Do you believe that number? Because I don't know if I do.
I don't know if I believe it, but I am certain they probably had to find some money because
Yeah.
because I believe with Penn State basketball on a much smaller scale. I know that conversation happened in December around, oh, they're being successful. We're meeting with people in New York City. We need to talk about, we might have to retain people. And it has become that. So when I saw that number, my first thought was somebody from Penn State football is going to make sure how much money they have in the bank and how much money the group has to offer to people.
I'm just doing some calculator math here. Hold on. I think I entered. I mean, that's not small change per athlete. If there are 100 of them on the team, if I entered this.
Oh, and that's you giving it out in a socialist manner where everybody gets the same amount.
Yeah, yeah.
Somebody's making some good money, and some other people are getting enough to be fine.
So I don't know. Like, the reason I bring this up, because we'll get into the finances thing here in a second. And this goes back to the point we keep harping on, and I feel like we sound like a broken record, is like just a little bit of transparency on this stuff would be great, because I actually think it would breed competition. I think in Penn State's case, and for Penn State fans that have bitched and moaned about this, this would be a good smack in the face if Ohio State really is bringing in 13 million and whatever Michigan's driving and whatever even Michigan State is driving. Like, okay, like here's where you are as a program. How can I, a fan, if I have to compete with this, if I have to be involved with this, how can I kind of contribute towards that? And I think that's, I know you don't want to, you don't like that reality, but that is the reality of having to have a good football program or a good any program,
No, it's a
really.
good any
It,
program.
yeah.
I mean,
So
I thought about with wrestling this weekend. Penn State goes out and beats Michigan, and Michigan has 4 people it brought in on transfers who probably didn't come to Michigan for free. Maybe they got good wrestler money, but still, it was, it's kind of funny as the Penn State fan. Okay, so you guys brought in 4, and not that Penn State hasn't, because it has, but you guys brought in 4 people, and oh, is it still close? Oh no, it's not.
yeah.
Right. So, but I mean, that's probably the Ohio State perspective on somebody else who's spending, if Penn State were to spend in football.
No, I think that's a perfect way to look at it. I hadn't really thought about it that way, but I've been thinking about just with wrestling and the scores that they put up and the stats that they put up type thing, and in terms of Cael Sanderson's dominance. And yeah, that's, you're right. Like that, like for whatever reason, and we should probably like spend a deeper dive on this, and maybe we will in the future. But like, why is Pennsylvania the state that wrestling is we'll have a blank check for? Because that's really what the wrestling program at Penn State pretty much has, a blank check, and the other programs don't, and it's kind of confusing, and I don't understand it, but maybe I do. So, anyways, want to get your thoughts there? Anything else on the Ohio State?
No, he'll just look weird in those colors.
It's
And
it's
I
weird.
hope they
It's
have
gonna
some
weird.
fighters on the roster for him. That'll be great for him.
It's 100% weird. I just there's it's like
Guess they were Alabama red, so it's no big deal.
yeah, I guess, but even those pictures still looked weird. Like and those pictures exist and are real, and it looked weird at the time, and it looked weird now looking back at those. Um, I will still, Bill O'Brien will still be, even when this season is, and whenever this little tenure here at Ohio State is done, we'll still. I mean, he was the coach of my. It was the coach when I was a student. Like it was. I never had Joe as a coach as a student, and I just, I don't know. I was gonna appreciate Bill O'Brien. It would just be very uncomfortable for the fact that he's working and employed by Ohio State. Okay. Speaking of money, would you like to get into the money of college athletics? I guess would be the
Let's
best
hear it.
way
I
to
know you
say
did
it.
research. You got
I
your
did
calculator on your
research.
desktop there. This is going to be big stuff.
I come prepared, Steve. I come prepared. Okay. So I want to talk about this in a couple of ways. I want to first kind of present my opinion on the state of Penn State athletics through the state of their finances, would be the best way. So for those of you that are catching up, every year, required by the NCAA, Penn State is required to release a report that says, here's how much money we've spent and here's how much money we've earned. Now, they don't have to get particularly granular, but they do get granular down to like sports equipment and travel funds, etc. But we don't necessarily know coaches' salaries. Of course, Pennsylvania has the protection for whatever reason around the salary of the head coach, or only of the head coach of the football team and the men's basketball team being known, and we don't really know any other salary for the most part, even assistants within football. I think the most important and interesting note that came out to me, two things that came out to me that stuck out to me, and I didn't necessarily outline them. One of them I outlined, but the other one I didn't. Is now Penn State now generates over $200 million of revenue, which is um, an upper tier NCAA program. Ohio State being another one. To me, it is not surprising to hear, and I think that is also great to hear if you care about Penn State athletics, because you probably do want to be in that portion. What was surprising, actually sitting down and looking at the numbers, because I hadn't really looked at the numbers in a long time, is just how much money Penn State like spends, right? They only made so they spent $202 million last year, and they made a revenue of 126,000, which obviously to you and I is still a lot of money. That would be a great salary to have type thing. But I don't know. That's that's not necessarily like a lot of money. Now, a year ago, they did turn a $10 million profit, and I think that's probably why we see the spending the way it is. So here's what I'm wondering based on what these numbers tell me. Is this the way spending is going to go with Pat Kraft in the Pat Kraft era at Penn State, where they're going to spend kind of up to that max, but maybe still make a slight profit, so that there's money being pumped into the bank? And is that because this is really Pat Kraft's first full year as being AD? Is that his MO, or was that just because of the $10 million surplus the previous season or previous year? And are we going to find that out next, like when we have this report this time next year? So that was what was most interesting to me at looking at these numbers and kind of contextualizing these numbers. When you went through them, Steve, and I don't know with what detail, was there anything in particular that stood out to you? Because there was another thing that stood out to me, that a couple of people called out.
No, I think it's the spending in general. It's not the spending in general. That's the way large organizations like this function. You know, the rainy day, you know, tucking away money doesn't happen with the facilities arms race, with all the things they have going on. So no, I don't think, I think that just stuck out. Like it's like giving a kid an allowance, right? They're going to spend what you give them, right? You know, and that's what athletics has always felt like to me, and is part of the reason I could get closer to student athletes being paid, is because everybody else is on their back, right? Everything else is on their back. How about we not do some certain things, but then you can't not do certain things, because then you're losing the race for whatever it is, facility support, whatever else. So I think that's what sticks out when people, and just the sheer amount of money that people are willing to pay for stuff, right? That
Yeah.
it's on TV, dude, or do that. Like, it's amazing to me that what that affinity for a sporting event will encourage people to spend.
Well, so let's start there with people spending. Penn State in 2022, 2023, so the Rose Bowl slash NCAA tournament year. That's to give you a state of mind. Penn State made $47.9 million in ticket sales from all of its sports, with 41 million of that being football. Which obviously we knew that football brings in the most, but then we layer in the other 10 million that people are spending on concessions and you know parking and everything else. And I think this is why, like, obviously it doesn't necessarily work out this way, but like you divide that over a family of four and what the cost becomes, like this is why people gripe about Beaver Stadium concession stands not necessarily being the best in the country. They want to maximize and get the most out of their dollar in the experience. Now, do they have a great experience at the games in the stadium themselves? In my opinion, yes. Like for as much as we nitpick on this podcast about this and that within Penn State football's experience, particularly with the game day experience presentation, I think it's still one of, if not the best in the Big Ten that I've been to, and I've been to every Big Ten stadium. So that was interesting to me. But the number that Ben Jones pointed out that was most interesting to me, and then somebody else kind of in a comment section actually called this out. Penn State essentially would not have turned a profit had they not turned beer cells on in 2022. So,
Or they just spent less somewhere else.
yeah, or they would have spent less somewhere else. But that was really interesting, and it's amazing to me that Pat Kraft hasn't gone and knocked on doors or whatever to get beer in the BJC, beer in all of Pagula, beer even in Rec Hall. Like I don't understand. To me, it seems like it feels like a no-brainer decision. Obviously, there's a liquor license. Obviously, there's legal and all of this other stuff that they have to go through. But after seeing these numbers, I mean, it essentially Penn State made $100 or $1.7 million more in concessions, particularly from football, than they did the previous year, all because halfway through the season they turned beer sales on. So we don't even know what the full season looks like and the impact of that yet. And it certainly felt like that was more well known that you could buy beer.
Well, you have out Pagula has it in the suites, right? And the
Mhm.
suites in the upper level, that upper the suite area. So that's good. Good for them financially. And I have not been to a men's basketball game this year, but I feel like when we saw the Wisconsin game, some dude in the stands was holding a glass that looked, I don't know, a clear glass that looked like, I guess it probably wasn't beer, or we didn't know that they were said there'd be a story about it, I guess. But it didn't look like a BJC cup, like a white cup. It looked like a clear cup that had amber color liquid in it. So I don't know whether I'm
Well,
missing
maybe
something.
we're wrong then. Maybe I'm
I mean,
wrong.
it's possible, because shame on me for not going to a men's game, but they're on TV. So
Well, and I think it's kind of like we talk about, not to get like weirdly political, but we talk about like weed sales in state. We talk about gambling in states. States are going to do it because they see money. Like you could easily see the money from it. It kind of becomes a no-brainer. So to me, I don't know. I just think you look at the numbers there, and that was surprisingly very interesting. A couple of other interesting numbers. I think the basketball ticket sales number was the most surprising to me out of all of these. It went up over $1 million, all because Penn State had a good basketball team. So that shows what happens when you invest in your basketball program. It might not happen overnight. It might not happen tomorrow, but you build momentum for your program the way Micah Shrewsbury did, and it appears that Penn State fans will return that with ticket sales.
was ticket sales a separate line from the NCAA share thing, like that they get for being there? Or does
I, I,
that show up in the same year? That might not show up to a year down the road.
I
So
believe it there's an NCAA like part, but
okay.
I think the way I read it was through separate ticket sales. And then the other one that was interesting to me that I think is something to keep an eye on is two sports as ticket sales grow. One of which is built a relatively newer stadium and get you to pay attention to them a little bit more. Or at least this sport is growing. The other one I think is starting to get a foothold in this state specifically. Men's lacrosse essentially doubled their ticket revenue year over year, up to 18,000. Obviously, not a ton of money for Penn State in the grand scheme, really a drop in the bucket, but interesting to note that it's growing for a program that is kind of growing in a sport that is growing. And additionally, the one that I'm most interested in is I really feel like women's hockey is going to be the next it sport, so to speak. And I think that's going to be a gateway for more girls to get their attention into hockey. And that went up about 50%. Their ticket revenue went up 50%. So
Well, and
good for them.
they were both, well, lacrosse
Decent.
for sure was
Yeah.
free in your lifetime at some point, and women's hockey was darn close to free the first year if it wasn't.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I think that was something they did probably 10 years ago. For some other sports, they started charging tickets just to say, okay, coaches, you're going to make $5,000 extra dollars somewhere through the year. At least you can do something with it if you sell the tickets. And it was kind of on them to drive interest and help market and sell those things. So yeah, there's not much free as it relates to Penn State athletics anymore, from tickets to any part of it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's just the way it is.
I don't mind it. I don't mind it as long as people don't get priced out, particularly for sports the lower or the non-revenue driving sports the way football or and I
No,
mean
and I
I do
think their
mind it for
coaches
football, but
would
you know what I mean.
be careful of that as well. Like, hey, we can't increase this too much and nobody's going to show up. Like at some
Right.
point, it's not a value.
Right. So I think that was interesting. Um, the other thing that was interesting that I was curious about going back to our NIL discussion is the contributions, which is your Line Club contribution for your tickets, only essentially went up like $1 million year over year. With NIL existing, this kind of being one of the first really bigger years of NIL, in my opinion, at Penn State. Um, it's interesting to see that there wasn't necessarily a drop. I don't know what it grew. Like you could go look it up, but I don't know what it grew previous years, if that was a smaller growth amount. So I think that's going to be an important number to keep an eye on in the
Well,
future.
and that grew in some part too, because I think they added, I don't think I had a hockey contribution until this season. Like I
Okay.
didn't have to have an NIL Nittany Lion Club contribution to get my hockey tickets until this season was the first season I remember seeing that.
Okay.
So there's probably a decent chunk of that realistically.
Yeah, and I do know that, we talked about this a little bit on Twitter this week, but the season ticket went up contribution for most of the lower bowl, really everybody's seats for by $100, or at least the north end zone all the way wrapping around. To me, that is your gas money for your athletes going to the West Coast. That's what that is. Like, it's very apparent that that's what that money line is for. So those were the relatively interesting numbers that I saw. That was it, that in terms of revenue. So between TV tickets and the contributions, that's essentially a little over about 60% of Penn State's revenue for the year. So that's interesting to keep in mind. Now, expenses. What going back to what surprised me, and something that maybe you've harped on and griped on a little bit, the number one cost for Penn State was not head coaches or coaches' salaries. It was support staff / administrative compensation at $39 million. So essentially, for every dollar that you make through Penn State football ticket sales is going out the door towards administrative and support staff. Interested to see that number and the way that number grows or doesn't grow, or I think that's just I wonder what I would also like to get that number and compare it to other Big Ten schools, because that feels particularly high. Not discrediting anything people do, but I don't know.
Oh, it might be where other people are. Although, I mean, again, men's basketball, just because I wrote it the past week, you got a 17-person support staff. That's who makes the website, and a couple of them I get it are graduate assistants, but they're still listed as the support staff. You got a 17-member support staff for men's basketball? Like, I'm just not, and it's the same way with the athletic department. Again, the number of student athletes who've been added at Penn State is 2 hockey teams in the past 30 years. The number of student athletes otherwise has been the same. Somehow, some way, those teams were competitive in the landscape that existed then, with much fewer people making sure they somehow succeeded. So, and I know the world's changed. It's just amazing to me, the growth, maybe bloat is the wrong word, the administrative creep that has happened in athletics across the board everywhere, because it's not just Penn State. I don't know. It's a little unbecoming on the backs of the kids in some ways. I mean, it's to me, as like you said, it's something I've chimed in on before. It's even worse than the other stuff that's happened on the kids' back, because these are actual people who are like, oh, just here to support you. Thanks for making my job possible. I don't know. Just
Yeah,
feels weird.
it would be interesting to almost have like a survey, right? Like do, and you see this from time and time again on like Twitter and like, and I think football is the outlier in really anytime we talk about these numbers. Football is very much the outlier because they're gonna get most of that money. But like fencing or tennis, golf, those sports, like do those kids feel the same support that wrestling, hockey, football feel? That would be what would be interesting to me. And I think about that just even visually in terms of the facilities that are available at Penn State. So that was interesting. The other thing that was one of the more surprising numbers of all of this, so $23 million goes towards room, board, and tuition for Penn State athletes. With the number 2 team being women's hockey, at like 1.2-ish million. And it just was kind of a surprise. It makes sense because they've got a lot of athletes, and the way their scholarships get divided up. But it was kind of an interesting little nugget if you've never really paid attention to that.
They knew that when they came in. I mean, that's why they tried to pitch an equestrian team as a way to balance out instead of hockey. Like, I mean, it wasn't a foregone conclusion that there was going to be men's and women's hockey when it first started. But a couple administrators kind of, I think, went to the mat to make sure the women's hockey team became something. Because otherwise, that there really wasn't the Pagula gift wasn't for both sports. It was for men's hockey, and athletics had to find some stuff for the women, and they knew that they were going to be costly going forward.
Yeah, I think that
So they
was
should win some games and drive some attendance to help pay that stuff
yeah.
back.
And I like the way that program is headed. Let me see, look at the other interest. $5.2 million on sports equipment. $5.2 million. Now, I don't know if that's like all I would assume that's not necessarily the Nike stuff. That's like footballs and like sticks and pads and etc. But that's a lot of money. I mean, it makes sense, but that's a
31
lot of
teams, stuff's
it's
not
a
cheap.
lot of money. So that one was interesting. And let's see what else was interesting in there. The other thing was the essential, like, not disparity, probably. Yeah, no, it's a disparity. Let's call it what it is, between men's and women's sports. So 17 million goes towards men's head coaches, with 7 million of that being for James Franklin, and I think maybe like 3 million, or I might be overinflating that number off the top of my head, be it for going to
Which roads?
Mike Rhodes. But only 3.9 million goes towards head coaches of women's programs. Which is just, that was a bit surprising to see. Um, that wasn't as even as I necessarily would have thought it would be. Of course, it probably more aligns to where the money comes from, and you know, none of the women's sports are really revenue producing in the same way that the men's sports are at Penn State.
Right. And I think that's always the Title IX challenge, that stuff and whatever, those numbers and what does revenue producing mean versus, just plain old equity. And yeah, it translates up to the WNBA. I was listening today with, we may talk Caitlin Clark a little later. The average salary in the women's NBA is like $81,000, right? And people are like, that's not very much. Well, that's what the market is bearing, apparently. Like, there's not going to be millionaire in terms of playing salary, WNBA stuff. There's probably not going to be millionaire women's coaches, except for a small handful across the country.
And I wonder what I would be willing to bet at least 99% of those. I gotta think maybe even 100% of those of the highest paid women's coaches are basketball, right?
I
Like,
would think so. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I can't, of the top, let's say top 20.
I'd be surprised if there was two in the top 20 that weren't women's basketball, perhaps, of the highest paid collegiate women's coaches.
Yeah, I wonder. It it would be very interesting, as somebody that's generally curious. It would be very interesting to see what each of the head coaches make. We don't know that, but would be very interesting. So that was relatively it for the numbers. I hope we could kind of provide some context around them and what we saw, what was interesting there. Anything else you want to add about the old financial report?
No, related, but not related. So I forgot to tell you, I was actually at an event this weekend, not on the Penn State campus, on another major university campus, sat in the hockey arena to watch Penn State lose. And what was interesting is what wasn't there again. We've had this conversation about Notre Dame and some other places. Nothing was for sale inside for sale. There was lots for sale. There was nothing for sale on the dasher boards or the ice that wasn't Notre Dame, which, and I don't think the money's that significantly different. It's just interesting what places monetize and what they choose not to monetize, and what their look and feel is like based on that.
It's always kind of jarring to watch a Notre Dame hockey game, specifically because of that, because you don't see the ads. Like, your brain is so trained to see those ads on the boards there, and they don't have them. They're one of the few schools in the country that doesn't have ads there.
Yeah,
maybe the only one that I can think of off the top of my head.
It took me a second too, like, because one of the ads is kind of set up. It almost looks like an Anderson Windows ads, because that's what my mind looks like with the fightingirish.com. And I was like, I elbowed Susan. I'm like, hey, what do you notice about the arena? She's like, what do you mean? She's like, I'm like, well, you can't see it, but once you see what you can't see, you won't be able to unsee it.
Right.
And she's like, what are you saying? I'm like, give it a second. And she's like, oh yeah, that's right. Like, there's nothing. I get it.
Did they have ribbon board ads?
No ribbon board.
No ribbon board scoreboard?
Nothing on the scoreboard.
I would like to go to that.
The only ad was a pregame. They had a pregame slap shot thing for $250 that they brought 3 people out on the ice. But even, I don't even know if there's stuff on the Zamboni. I don't think there was stuff on the Zambonis.
That's interesting.
So,
I mean,
yeah,
it makes sense for there. I mean,
it is, and I get it. It's just, but I don't think they're making so much more from the NBC and Peacock deal. Like, I still think they're making less than Penn State is, but they don't have 31 sports to pop up either.
Yeah, no, that's true. They don't have as many sports there, which is interesting. I think about that a lot. Like, think about that with Penn State, particularly in this whole boom of women's wrestling, right? Like, it makes sense for Penn, like, geographically or not ethically, but I don't know what the word is there. It's in the ethos of Penn State in Pennsylvania to get a women's wrestling team going. Lock Haven has one, for Christ's sake, and Iowa has one. Why doesn't Penn State? But then you kind of like have to like look at these numbers, right?
Right.
So so yeah, all right. That's about it. That's about it for that stuff. Let's move on to this good question that you have for me about Penn State basketball.
I forget how I phrased it. What are
Oh
you
my
most
gosh.
interested? Which one are you most interested in, most or least interested in? Women's basketball or men's basketball at this point? Is that what I texted?
All right, here we go. To the text messages from Steve. Which are you more optimistic slash
Oh,
care
optimistic.
about? Men's or women's hoops, referring to Penn State
There
women's.
you go.
Um,
So if you know the question, why are you busting my chops? Why don't you
I
just
guess I
answer
would
it?
just like to tease you.
Okay.
Okay. Gun to my head type thing. I feel more optimistic about the fact that the women's program is headed back in the direction that it was for much of my childhood, right? Like, and I know that that sounds weird, but like there was a lot of pride in Penn State women's basketball, particularly in the early part of the 2000s or early on that the Kelly Mazzanti era, right? Like, and even the players behind you and like even when I was a student in that I think it was my junior year they won a Big Ten title, right? Like a regular season title. It was a point of pride and it was very hard to watch that program drop off. So I am to see it turn around the way it has under Carolina, I am more optimistic, more hopeful about that. Not, but I would, but I'm. It's funny how like over particularly this transition happened like mid college, right? Like I have become much more a Penn State men's basketball fan. Like I will sit down and make Penn State men's basketball appointment viewing. If the Lady Lions are on, I will happen to turn them on. Now, as they get good again, I will probably start to pay even more attention to them. So I hope that provides clarity on your answer. But I would say towards a goal, a higher achieving goal, Penn State women's basketball.
Okay. I think that makes sense. So I'm hearing, so how much patience do you expect to have, do you expect to need for the men to be good again? Like
I,
tournament level good again?
tournament level good again.
Because they've been, this has scared me, and I kind of hinted at in the story I wrote. They've been to the tournament. In theory, you could make the argument they were tournament level under the past two coaches, right?
Right.
So if Rhodes gets in there, holy cow, they might almost be basketball competent. Three coaches and three tournament level teams, if that happens.
Looking at the amount of money that they spent on that program, looking at and then laying it out that way, the way you just laid it out, and then laying it out in terms of expectations of what Mike Rhodes did at VCU, and now has to do at Penn State in the same, maybe not
Mhm.
to necessarily the same level, but in some similar fashion. And then the fact that Micah Shrewsbury really did it in what two seasons. I will be it will be a mild disappointment next year if Penn State doesn't make the tournament because they're a 500 team right now. Like I don't know if they'll necessarily finish out that way, but they're a 500 level team. What does he get? What's he gets even more of his guys in terms of a recruiting class in. And then obviously the transfer portal really spins harder in basketball. Um, I don't know. I just like I was reading, I went back and was reading what we wrote about that tournament run and I still believe that Micah Shrewsbury was the proof that Penn State basketball can be a thing, right? Like and so it's there's no more excuses. I don't have the
Okay.
patience for a 10 years like I did with Pat Chambers.
Okay. I just didn't know. That was my sense of where you were going, but I just didn't
Yeah.
know. So thanks. Okay, cool.
What about you? Same question to you.
I think I would be, the women felt so far off that I'm a little surprised at how well they're doing this
Hmm.
season. And that the whole cobble together a lineup and transfer people in and do whatever else feels like it should be tougher for women in some ways than men. Just, I don't know, just because relationships, right? Like, and then that's stereotypical, but I don't know. I guess I'm more surprised about the women than the men this year, honestly.
The way it clicked was surprising, I think, this year. The way it has clicked after what
Yeah,
we've
just because it looks, I
yeah.
mean, it just felt like excuse. I mean, I get everybody else in the world had COVID, everybody else had some, other people had coaching changes, whatever else. It just felt like there was a bigger gap to close this year, if they were going to be good. But they might have done a decent job of closing it. Um, we'll see as they play out. I mean, maybe they're going to be tournament level this year, and that would be a big thing. I think a big credit to Keegs and the team and whatever else. And the men, yeah, I don't have I mean, I kind of say it facetiously, but it's true. They're not asking me to do anything. They just want to go out and win basketball games, and that's great. So as long as you're not asking me to climb, do whatever else, and you're just going to go prove yourself, go ahead. But yeah, it probably shouldn't take 10 years. And I think it'll probably take 2 or 3, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I think
And if it
that's
doesn't take 2 or 3, I think it'll be interesting to see the fan base's patience with that
yeah.
in the new world.
Yeah, and I wonder how whatever happens with the football program, whether it's good or bad over the next really 2, 3 years, like distracts or adds to that circumstance, right?
Right.
No, I think that's about where I'm at with it too. So okay. Um that's good. Let's move on to this week's old guy, young guy. Which I think we've debated similar things around this, but you want to tee this one up as well?
I teed it up a little bit, or I just pitched it to you a little bit because of the Caitlin Clark Ohio State girl running incident, which I thought was going to get more national attention today than it did, which is great. That I'm glad it didn't become like this thing. So I guess I'm just more curious about court storming in general. Like, is it in my experience at Penn State, we were never good enough at basketball for that to be a thing. Like, they didn't beat anybody that mattered. The biggest moment that I can remember as a student was the Oklahoma cheerleaders showing up with the Oklahoma team to play us at Rec Hall, but didn't win, so didn't need to storm the court. Football, we didn't because we were better than everybody. Like, you don't do that, you know? So I don't know. Like, I mean, because there's a part of me with the whole Wisconsin thing last week. Look, they're 11 or whatever they were. They save it for a top 5 team. Feels like there should be rules. You may storm the court if
If
if they are a
Steve's
top 5 team that you haven't beaten in the past 5 years on your floor, something like that.
this is Steve's guide to court storming.
It's like my church coffee thing. Yes, you can't get coffee if you're under 10. No.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. Okay. The Caitlin Clark thing was hilarious to me because there were a couple tweets that were we're kind of blaming the fan, and it was very clearly Caitlin Clark's fault that she ran into this other fan. Like, she was not paying attention. That being said, I think it's a good thing for women's basketball that court storming is happening because it means something. And
Yep.
obviously, there was a great graphic going around this weekend of what Caitlin Clark does essentially to attendance for the opposing teams and how all of these schools are getting sold out when these happen. But I think you don't see that happen in women's basketball very often. I couldn't really remember a time when it happened, so I thought that was great. Um, I have no problem with court storming. I have no problem with it the other night against Wisconsin, particularly because I think in a lot of ways that was like a breath of fresh air win for Penn State basketball. That, like, you know what, like, this isn't going to be a perfect season, but there's going to be good moments, and I think this was an opportunity for Penn State students to celebrate that. I stormed the court once as a student. That was the Penn State Michigan game, Trey Burke game, which I think we've talked about that before. I, there was one year, I think it was my senior year, because we made 3 separate poster fronts at the Collegian about it. But there were 3 separate court storming, and that felt like a lot. Like, you get 1 per season.
Let's see, there go. There's rules. Now you're on the board
1
with the
per
rules.
season. Yeah.
There might have been one in my career. There might have been. I think I was covering the game. It was probably Penn State winning the Atlantic 10 at Rec Hall against
That's
Rhode Island in
different, though.
'91. Right, like that felt
That's
like
different.
and that was like the first high water mark at home in a long time, right? So that probably made sense.
And I think even the the storming the field for football games is
I guess, have you done that?
fine.
Was my next question. Have you
So
done that?
the only time in my lifetime that's ever really been the opportunity was the 2016 Ohio State game, and that's so yes, we went down on the field then, but I have no problem with it for the most part. There was one time, it was the Will Levis Sean Clifford game, 2019. Ohio State, it was right before Thanksgiving break, and Ohio State fans went onto the field, like they ran onto the field at the end of the game. And I didn't necessarily understand why, because it wasn't an upset. It was just, I think it was their biggest game of the season. So that was kind of, I in general support college football field storming. And I think it's dumb when the SEC and some of these other conferences punish you greatly for doing it. Because I don't know, you're never going to do that in pro football. It's a
Yeah,
part
I
of the
don't,
tradition and part
I
of
get the
the
argument,
gusto.
but like, it's not as, to me, it's really, I'm sure there's people that have been hurt. I mean, the only person that didn't get off the court safely for Iowa the other day was Caitlin Clark, right? The number of football players that don't get off the field safely is one or two, and we're not talking career-ending injuries. We're talking getting bumped into people. I don't think stuff for the most part is mean-spirited at places. I mean, I'm sure some kids have gotten in other kids' faces, and you gotta, try to mitigate that as best you can. But yeah, I think we've accepted it as part of what we do, and if it's something that doesn't, that they outlaw or get rid of, I think we lose a little something.
I'm surprised, and maybe there was a little bit of a plan with the Caitlin Clark thing, but like I'm surprised that more university police slash arena management slash athletic departments don't have like a better plan for escorting the opposing team off the court.
And
Uh,
we don't know. They might have. Like, I haven't dug
yeah,
into that rabbit hole deep enough. They might have said, "Hey, this is where you're supposed to go." Because I mean, there's only one Iowa player that was running down through there. I mean, the other ones and the coaches got to the back without any incident. So maybe somebody just took a wrong route, or was maybe
yeah,
freaked out, or who knows, or was looking to take a charge. I don't know. Whatever. Like, I mean, unfortunately, I mean, what a awful place social media was slash interesting place, man. That kid was getting beat up left and right, for that too. So
that one was Caitlin Clark's fault. She's the greatest women's basketball player, at least of the last few years, particularly college basketball. That was on her. That one was on her.
I
So,
don't disagree.
all right. Anything else you want to discuss on the podcast this week?
No, that's good. That's enough
It was
ticking my
long.
people from Iowa
I'm
off.
sorry. I'm sorry if we were long. Um, there's just so much to talk about. That's all. Okay. Let's see. I was going to do a newsletter this week, so I'll probably do a newsletter this week. Steve, if you would like to join said newsletter, you're more than welcome to, but you don't have to. Probably send that Thursday or Friday. Um, there's that. Uh, there's schedules on the website for some of those sports we talked about today. So that's good. Um, let's see what else. We've got a website which Steve wrote something for last week. It was kind of the 5 T's of Penn State basketball. 5 stages of being a Penn State basketball fan or caring about Penn State basketball.
Mhm.
And it was good. I enjoyed it. So make sure you check that out. Um, other than that, we've got a website, as I mentioned. It's called stuffsummersays.com. On that website, there's a section called
Steve,
with Steve. We've got emails. Mine's Darian at stuffsummersays.com. Steve's is
Steve at stuffsummersays.com.
we've got a podcast that you're listening to. If you're watching it on the YouTube, hit that subscribe button somewhere in that general vicinity. If not, you're listening, you can 5 stars and thumbs up. We appreciate that. Other than that, we've got Twitter handles. Mine's at Stuff Summer Says. Steve's is
At Steve Sampsell.
have a good week, pals.